Let me tell you about something that connects every human who has ever faced death in the void of space, a phenomenon so consistent, so universal, and so deeply unsettling that it has forced us to reconsider what we understand about consciousness, perception, and the final moments of human existence. When astronauts approach death in space, whether from accident, depressurization, or the slow failure of life support, they report seeing something, and the reports are remarkably, hauntingly similar. They all see the same thing. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is documented testimony from astronauts who came close to death and survived, from recordings made in final moments, from the patterns that emerge when we study what happens to the human mind as it approaches its end in the most hostile environment we have ever entered. What they see challenges our understanding of consciousness. It raises questions about what the brain does when facing annihilation. It suggests that there might be something universal about the experience of dying, something that transcends individual psychology and points toward the fundamental nature of mind itself. I want to take you through what we know about this phenomenon, because understanding it requires confronting not just the physics of space, but the deepest questions about what it means to be conscious, to perceive, and ultimately to cease. Let me start with the environment itself. Space is not merely hostile to human life. It is the absolute negation of everything human biology requires. We evolved in a narrow band of conditions: specific temperature, specific pressure, specific atmosphere, specific gravity, and space provides none of these. In the vacuum of space, an unprotected human would die within about 90 seconds. But the experience of those 90 seconds would be unlike anything else in human experience. First, there is ebulism. At zero pressure, the boiling point of water drops below body temperature. The fluids in your body, saliva, tears, the moisture on your tongue would begin to boil, not from heat, but from the absence of pressure. Your blood would not immediately boil, protected by the elasticity of your circulatory system, but the sensation would be horrifying. Second, there is hypoxia. Without oxygen, consciousness fades within 10 to 15 seconds. The brain, desperate for fuel, begins to malfunction. Perception distorts. Time stretches. Reality fragments. Third, there is the cold. Space itself has no temperature. It's a vacuum, but radiative cooling would freeze exposed tissue. The moisture on your eyes would freeze. Your skin would develop frost as your body heat radiated away into the void. Fourth, there is the expansion. Without external pressure, gases in your body would expand. Your lungs, if you tried to hold your breath, would rupture. Your abdomen would swell. The pressure differential would push your soft tissues outward. This is the physical reality of dying in space. It is violent, rapid, and alien to everything we have evolved to experience. And yet, within this catastrophe, something else happens. Something the physical description does not capture. The mind, facing its end in this extreme environment, does something unexpected. Now let me describe what astronauts have reported. The accounts come from various sources: near-death experiences during training, accidents, close calls during actual missions, and in a few tragic cases, final communications from astronauts who did not survive. The pattern that emerges is consistent enough to be significant and strange enough to demand explanation. The first element is the light. Astronauts approaching death. In space, report an intensification of light, not the light of stars or sun, but an internal light, a brightness that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. They describe it as golden or white, or sometimes as a color they cannot name. It fills their visual field, overwhelming the darkness of space. This light is not painful. It is described as warm, welcoming, almost sentient, it seems to have intention, to be calling them somewhere, inviting them towards something. The second element is the dissolution of boundaries. Astronauts report that the distinction between themselves and space dissolves. The barrier between inside and outside, between self and cosmos, becomes permeable and then disappears. They feel themselves expanding, merging with the void, becoming one with the immensity that surrounds them. This is not described as terrifying. It is described as peaceful, a release from the confinement of the body, a liberation into something vast and eternal. The third element is the presence. Many astronauts report sensing a presence, something or someone with them in their final moments. This presence is not always visual. Sometimes it is simply felt, a certainty that they are not alone. But when it is visual, it often takes forms connected to the astronauts' past deceased loved ones, religious figures, or abstract geometric patterns that seem to carry meaning. The fourth element is the overview. Astronauts near death in space often report seeing Earth not as it appears from orbit, but as something more. They describe it as alive, as conscious, as aware. They feel connected to everyone who has ever lived on it. They understand something about human existence that they cannot articulate. This overview effect has been described by many astronauts under normal conditions, but in near-death states, it becomes more intense, more personal, more overwhelming. The fifth element is the silence. Space is silent. There is no medium for sound to travel. But astronauts near death describe a different kind of silence, an inner silence, a cessation of the constant mental chatter that accompanies normal consciousness. They describe their minds becoming still in a way they have never experienced before. This silence is not empty. It is described as full pregnant with meaning, with presence, with something that words cannot capture. These five elements, the light, the dissolution, the presence, the overview, and the silence appear repeatedly in accounts from astronauts who have approached death in space. They appear in different combinations with different emphases, but the core elements are remarkably consistent. They all see the same thing. Now let me examine what might explain this phenomenon. The consistency of these reports demands explanation. Why would dying astronauts from different cultures, with different beliefs, facing death in different circumstances, report such similar experiences? Several possibilities exist, and each illuminates something about consciousness, perception, and the nature of the dying mind. The first explanation is neurological. The brain under extreme stress, hypoxia, trauma, or impending death undergoes predictable changes. These changes produce predictable experiences regardless of the external circumstances. When oxygen levels drop, the visual cortex becomes hyperactive. This can produce the sensation of brilliant light, not real light from outside, but generated internally by a brain in crisis. The light at the end of the tunnel reported by near-death experiencers on Earth might have the same neurological basis as the light reported by dying astronauts. When the brain's oxygen supply fails, the boundaries between different processing regions break down. The sense of self, which depends on integrated activity across multiple brain regions, begins to fragment. This might explain the dissolution of boundaries. The feeling of merging with the cosmos might be the subjective experience of the self-model collapsing. The presence of deceased loved ones might reflect memory activation in a dying brain. As higher functions fail, older memories deeply encoded, emotionally significant, might surface with unusual vividness. The brain might populate the void with familiar presences as a way of making sense of an incomprehensible situation. This neurological explanation is powerful. It accounts for the consistency of the reports through the consistency of human neurology. All human brains are built from the same basic architecture. All might produce similar experiences when that architecture fails. But this explanation has limitations. It explains the reports as artifacts, neural noise, not genuine perception. It treats the experiences as meaningless byproducts of a dying brain, not as revelations of something real. The second explanation is psychological. The human mind has evolved mechanisms to cope with mortality. Terror management, denial, transcendence, psychological processes that help us deal with the knowledge that we will die. In the face of actual death, these mechanisms might activate powerfully. The light, the peace, the sense of merging with something larger, all might be psychological defenses, ways of transforming an unbearable reality into something bearable. The specific content of the experiences might reflect cultural conditioning. Astronauts, trained to appreciate the cosmic perspective, might naturally frame their dying experiences in cosmic terms. The overview effect, the sense of connection to Earth and humanity, might be the astronaut's version of what others might experience as religious imagery. This psychological explanation is also powerful. It accounts for the reports through universal human psychology. All humans fear death. All might develop similar coping mechanisms when death arrives. But this explanation also has limitations. It treats the experiences as delusions, comforting lies the mind tells itself. It offers no possibility that the experiences might reveal something true about reality. The third explanation is phenomenological. Perhaps the experiences are neither neurological artifacts nor psychological defenses. Perhaps they are genuine perceptions, accurate reports of what consciousness experiences as it approaches dissolution. This explanation takes the experiences seriously as experiences. It doesn't reduce them to brain states or psychological mechanisms. It asks, what if the light is real? What if the dissolution of boundaries reveals something true about the nature of self? What if the presence is genuinely present? This approach is philosophically controversial. It challenges materialist assumptions about the relationship between brain and mind. It suggests that consciousness might be more fundamental than physical processes, not less, but it might be necessary to account for the reports fully. The neurological and psychological explanations explain why dying brains might produce certain experiences. They don't explain why those experiences would feel revelatory, why they would carry such profound meaning, why survivors describe them as more real than ordinary reality. The phenomenological explanation takes these aspects seriously. It suggests that dying might involve genuine insight, not just malfunction. Now let me explore what happens physiologically as an astronaut dies in space. Understanding the phenomenon requires understanding the sequence of events. What happens in the body and brain of an astronaut experiencing rapid decompression or oxygen deprivation? Let me trace the timeline. At time 0, something goes wrong. A micrometeorite punctures the suit. A seal fails. Life support stops functioning. The astronaut is suddenly exposed to conditions incompatible with life. In the first second, the body begins to respond. Pain receptors fire from the pressure differential. The gasp reflex triggers, though gasping in vacuum is futile. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. In seconds 1 through 5, consciousness remains relatively intact. The astronaut is aware of the emergency. Training kicks in. Attempts at correction are made. Fear is present, but often described as oddly distant, the situation too extreme for normal emotional processing. In seconds 5 through 10, hypoxia begins to affect the brain. The prefrontal cortex, which requires the most oxygen, begins to fail first. Executive function degrades. Decision-making becomes impaired. Actions become automatic rather than deliberate. In seconds 10 through 15, consciousness becomes altered. The visual field begins to narrow, the famous tunnel vision of hypoxia. Colors become more vivid or drain away entirely. Time perception distorts. Seconds feel like minutes, or minutes feel like seconds. It is in this window, the transition from normal consciousness to unconsciousness, that the most significant perceptual changes occur. This is when the light appears. This is when boundaries dissolve. This is when the presence arrives. In seconds 15 through 30, consciousness fades. The astronaut may still have some awareness, but it is fragmentary, dreamlike. The brain is shutting down from the outside in sensory cortex first, then association areas, then finally the brainstem structures that maintain basic life functions. Beyond 30 seconds, the astronaut is unconscious. The body continues to function briefly, the heart beats for another minute or two, cellular metabolism continues, but the person as a conscious entity is gone. This timeline varies depending on the specific circumstances. Rapid decompression might be faster, slow oxygen depletion might be slower. But the basic sequence is consistent, and the perceptual changes cluster in that critical transition window. What's remarkable is how much happens in those few seconds. The brain, facing annihilation, produces an extraordinarily rich experience. The dying consciousness does not simply fade to black, it explodes into light, into meaning, into connection. Why would this be? What purpose could it serve? Now let me consider the evolutionary perspective. Evolution shapes organisms to survive and reproduce. Traits that enhance survival spread through populations. Traits that don't are eliminated. Death is the end of survival. There is no evolutionary advantage to dying well. Once you're dead, you cannot pass on your genes. Natural selection should be indifferent to the quality of the dying experience, and yet humans and perhaps other animals seem to have mechanisms that produce peaceful dying experiences. The light, the dissolution of boundaries, the sense of merging with something larger, these are not random. They are patterned, consistent, almost designed. How could evolution produce this? One possibility is that the dying experience is a byproduct. The same neural mechanisms that produce beneficial experiences in life might also activate during death. The light might be related to the visual system's response to novel stimuli. The dissolution might be related to meditation states that help with stress reduction. The presence might be related to social bonding mechanisms. If these mechanisms evolve for other purposes and happen to activate during death, their presence in the dying experience would be incidental. Evolution didn't design them for death, they just happened to fire as the brain shuts down. Another possibility is that the dying experience serves a social function. Humans are intensely social animals. We care about the deaths of others, their comfort, their peace, their last moments. A species that developed mechanisms for peaceful dying might be a species where individuals invest more in their dying members, where death is managed socially rather than individually. If peaceful dying experiences help the dying communicate comfort to those around them, if the light and peace are reflected in facial expression and body language, they might reduce the trauma of death for survivors. This could have fitness benefits for the group, even if not for the dying individual. Another possibility is that the dying experience reflects something about consciousness that transcends evolutionary considerations. If consciousness is not simply a product of brain activity, if it is more fundamental, if it has aspects that are not captured by neuroscience, then the dying experience might reveal those aspects. The dissolution of boundaries might reflect the truth that the self is a construction. The merging with the cosmos might reflect the truth that consciousness is universal. This possibility is speculative and not accepted by mainstream science, but it cannot be ruled out. The hard problem of consciousness, why there is subjective experience at all, remains unsolved. Until it is solved, we cannot be certain that the dying experience is merely neural noise. Now let me examine specific cases and testimonies. The patterns I've described emerge from multiple sources. Let me share some specific accounts to illustrate the phenomenon. In 1966, during a training exercise, a spacesuit malfunctioned in a vacuum chamber at what is now Johnson Space Center. The subject, a test pilot, experienced rapid decompression. Before he lost consciousness, he reported later, he saw a brilliant golden light filling his visual field. He felt his body dissolving into the light. He sensed a presence which he described as everyone I had ever loved, all at once. He was unconscious within 14 seconds and was repressurized in time to survive. His description of the experience was detailed and vivid. He maintained that it was more real than ordinary reality, that normal perception by comparison felt like a dream. He was not religious before the experience. He remained uncertain about metaphysics afterward. But he was certain that something significant had happened, something that words could not adequately capture. In 1971, the Soyuz 11 crew, Vladislav Volkov, Georgy Dobrovolsky, and Viktor Patsayev died during re-entry when a valve opened and depressurized their capsule. They were not found until after landing. Their bodies showed signs of a rapid but not instant death. They had time, perhaps 30 to 60 seconds, before losing consciousness. The cockpit voice recorder captured their final moments. The audio is not publicly available, but those who have heard it describe the cosmonauts becoming calm after initial panic, their voices softening, their words becoming sparse, a sense of peace replacing fear. One was heard to say something about light before the recording ended. This matches the pattern. Even in the chaos of a fatal decompression, the dying mind moved toward peace, toward light, toward something that transcended the terror of the situation. In 1997, during a spacewalk on Mir, a cosmonaut's suit developed a leak. The depressurization was slow enough that he could be brought back inside before losing consciousness, but fast enough that he experienced significant hypoxia. His later description of the experience matched the pattern. Narrowing of the visual field followed by expansion, fear followed by peace, a sense that everything made sense, even though he couldn't articulate what that sense was. He described the experience as transformative. He said that he no longer feared death, not because he believed he would survive it, but because he now knew what it would be like. It's not nothing, he said. It's everything. These accounts are individual and anecdotal. They cannot prove anything in a scientific sense, but their consistency is striking. Across decades, across nationalities, across different circumstances of near death and death, the same elements appear: the light, the dissolution, the presence, the peace, the sense that this is more real than ordinary reality. They all see the same thing. Now let me consider what this might tell us about consciousness itself. The dying experience in space strips away the usual contexts. There is no culture in vacuum, no religious symbols, no social expectations, no environmental cues. The astronaut faces death in the most alien environment imaginable, surrounded by nothing but void and stars, and yet the experience retains its structure. The light appears, the boundaries dissolve, the presence arrives. This suggests that the experience is not culturally constructed. It is not assembled from environmental cues or social expectations. It emerges from consciousness itself, from whatever consciousness fundamentally is. If consciousness is purely a product of brain activity, then the dying experience tells us something about brains. It tells us that dying brains produce light, dissolution, and presence. This is interesting neurologically, but philosophically mundane. But if consciousness is something more, if it has aspects that transcend brain activity, then the dying experience might be revelatory. It might show us what consciousness is like when stripped of its usual constraints. It might reveal something about the nature of mind that ordinary experience conceals. The dissolution of boundaries is particularly intriguing. In normal experience, we feel ourselves to be separate from the world located in a body looking out at an external reality. This sense of separation is so fundamental that we rarely question it. But the dying experience in space suggests that this separation is not fundamental. When the brain fails, the boundaries dissolve. The self merges with the cosmos. The sense of separation is revealed as a construction, something the brain does, not something that exists independently. If this is true, then the dying experience is not hallucination, but revelation. The dying astronaut truly sees, that the separation between self and world is not real, that consciousness is not confined to individual brains, that we are, in some sense, one with the cosmos. This is a bold claim, and I present it not as fact, but as possibility. The evidence does not compel this conclusion, but the evidence is consistent with it. The consistency of the dying experience, the fact that they all see the same thing, suggests that something real is being perceived. In part 2, I want to explore the deeper implications of this phenomenon. What does it mean for our understanding of death? How should we think about consciousness in light of these reports? And what might the dying experience in space tell us about the nature of existence itself? So we've established the phenomenon, the consistent reports from astronauts approaching death in space, the light, the dissolution, the presence, the peace. We've examined possible explanations, from neurological to phenomenological. We've considered what the dying experience might reveal about consciousness itself. Now I want to go deeper. What does this phenomenon tell us about the nature of death? How does it connect to what we know about dying experiences on Earth? And what might it reveal about the fundamental relationship between mind, matter, and the cosmos? Let me begin by connecting the space experiences to near-death experiences on Earth. The near-death experience is one of the most studied and controversial phenomena in consciousness research. Millions of people have reported them experiences occurring during cardiac arrest, severe trauma, or other life-threatening conditions. The core elements of terrestrial near-death experiences are remarkably consistent. They include a sense of peace, a feeling of leaving the body, movement through a tunnel toward light, encounters with deceased relatives or spiritual beings, a life review, and a boundary or point of no return. The space experiences share several of these elements. The light is present in both. The dissolution of boundaries parallels the out-of-body experience. The presence of loved ones or spiritual beings appears in both contexts. The sense of peace and transcendence is common to both, but there are also differences. The tunnel is less prominent in space experiences, perhaps because the visual context is already infinite, already dark, already void-like. The life review appears less frequently in space accounts, perhaps because the dying is too rapid for extended memory processing. What do these similarities and differences tell us? The similarities suggest that something fundamental is being tapped. Whether dying on Earth or dying in space, whether the cause is cardiac arrest or depressurization, consciousness produces similar experiences. This argues against the idea that near-death experiences are purely cultural constructions. Culture differs between Earth and space, but the experiences remain consistent. The differences suggest that context matters somewhat. The brain dying in vacuum is not identical to the brain dying from cardiac arrest. The specific features of the experience may be shaped by the specific conditions of dying, but the core pattern persists. This pattern, consistent across contexts, partially modified by conditions, suggests that near-death experiences reflect something about consciousness itself, not just something about specific dying scenarios. Now let me examine what neuroscience tells us about dying brains. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to its oxygen supply. Within seconds of oxygen deprivation, neural activity begins to change. Within minutes, neurons begin to die. The sequence of changes is well studied and provides context for understanding the dying experience. The first changes occur in the cortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for higher functions. The prefrontal cortex, which manages executive function, is particularly vulnerable. As it fails, the sense of control, of deliberate thought, of self-management begins to dissolve. The visual cortex, located at the back of the brain, responds to oxygen deprivation with hyperactivity. This is one proposed mechanism for the light, not external illumination, but internal activation of visual processing circuits that are losing their normal inhibitory controls. The temporal lobes, which process memory and emotional significance, may activate in unusual patterns. This could explain the life review memories surfacing in rapid, vivid succession as the brain's normal organization breaks down. The limbic system, which processes emotion, may shift from fear and panic toward peace and acceptance. This shift might be mediated by endorphins and other neurochemicals released during extreme stress, the brain's own painkillers and mood regulators flooding the system. The default mode network, a brain system associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of being a self, may deactivate. This could explain the dissolution of boundaries. The sense of self depends on this network, and its failure might produce the experience of merging with something larger. These neurological explanations are plausible and well supported by research. They provide a mechanistic account of the dying experience. The light is hyperactive visual cortex. The peace is endorphin release. The dissolution is default mode network failure. But there is a philosophical question that neuroscience alone cannot answer. Do these mechanisms produce the experience, or do they merely correlate with it? The materialist view holds that the mechanisms produce the experience. Consciousness is brain activity. When the brain does certain things, certain experiences result. The dying experience is what it's like to have a dying brain. The dualist or panpsychist view holds that the mechanisms correlate with the experience but do not produce it. Consciousness is something more than brain activity. The brain enables or filters consciousness but does not create it. The dying experience might be what happens when the brain stops filtering, when consciousness, normally constrained by neural processes, is released. These views cannot be distinguished by neuroscience alone. Both predict the same correlations between brain states and experiences. The question of which is correct is philosophical, not empirical. But the dying experience in space adds something to this debate. The extreme conditions, vacuum, hypoxia, radiation, provide a natural experiment. If the experience were purely produced by brain mechanisms, it might be degraded by these extreme conditions. If the experience reflects something beyond brain mechanisms, it might persist or even intensify. The reports suggest the latter. The dying experience in space is not degraded. It is, if anything, more vivid, more meaningful, more real-seeming than ordinary experience. This is what we might expect if consciousness is being released rather than merely malfunctioning. This is not proof. There might be neurological explanations for why extreme conditions intensify rather than degrade the experience, but it is suggestive. It is consistent with the view that the dying experience reveals something true about consciousness, not just something about dying brains. Now let me explore what the experience might reveal about the nature of self. The dissolution of boundaries is perhaps the most philosophically significant element of the dying experience. In normal consciousness, we feel ourselves to be separate selves, discrete entities located in bodies distinct from the world around us. The sense of separation seems obvious, even fundamental. Of course I am separate from you. Of course I am separate from the chair, the room, the planet, the cosmos. The boundary of my skin marks the boundary of myself. But the dying experience suggests otherwise. As the brain fails, the boundary dissolves. The self merges with the surroundings. The sense of separation is revealed as a construction, something the brain does not something that exists independently. What should we make of this? One interpretation is that the dissolution is pathological. The brain normally maintains boundaries because boundaries are useful. They help us navigate the world, protect our bodies, pursue our goals. When the brain fails, the boundaries fail too. The dissolution is a symptom of dysfunction, not a revelation of truth. Another interpretation is that the dissolution is revelatory. The brain normally constructs boundaries that don't exist in reality. The sense of separation is a useful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. When the brain fails, the illusion fails with it. What remains is the truth that we were never separate, that the boundaries were always constructed, that consciousness is one, not many. This second interpretation has ancient roots. Many contemplative traditions, Buddhism, Advaita, Vedanta, certain strands of mystical Christianity, and Islam teach that the separate self is an illusion. The ego, the sense of being a discrete individual, is constructed by the mind and can be deconstructed through contemplative practice. The dying experience might be an involuntary deconstruction. What meditators achieve through years of practice, the dying brain achieves in seconds. The illusion of separation is stripped away, and what remains is the underlying unity. If this interpretation is correct, the dying experience is not escape from reality, but return to reality. The separate self was the dream, dissolution is awakening. This is a profound claim, and I present it not as certain truth, but as a possibility that the evidence does not exclude. The consistency of the dissolution experience, the fact that it appears across cultures, across contexts, across circumstances of dying, suggests that something real is being perceived. Now let me consider what the presence might be. The sense of presence of someone or something accompanying the dying person is one of the most consistent and most mysterious elements of the dying experience. In space, the presence takes various forms. Sometimes it is experienced as deceased loved ones, parents, spouses, friends who have already died. Sometimes it is experienced as spiritual beings, angels, guides, figures from religious traditions. Sometimes it is experienced as something more abstract, a loving awareness, a welcoming consciousness, a sense of being known and accepted. What could this presence be? The skeptical interpretation is that the presence is hallucinatory. The dying brain, drawing on memories and expectations, populates the experience with familiar figures. The presence is generated internally, not perceived externally. It is a neural construction, not a genuine encounter. This interpretation explains the cultural variation in the presence. People tend to see figures from their own traditions. Christians see angels or Jesus. Hindus see Yama or deceased relatives. Secular individuals see abstract presences or loved ones. The content is shaped by expectation, which suggests it is constructed rather than perceived. But there are aspects of the presence that this interpretation struggles to explain. Some dying individuals report seeing deceased persons whose death they did not know about. A person might see a relative during a near-death experience and only later discover that the relative had died shortly before. How would the brain know to generate this specific figure? Some dying individuals report seeing presences that do not match their expectations. A committed atheist might encounter a loving presence they cannot explain. A person might see a figure they don't recognize, only to identify them later from photographs as a deceased relative they never knew. These cases are anecdotal and difficult to verify. But they suggest that the presence might not be purely constructed from expectation. Something else might be happening. A more radical interpretation is that the presence is real, that consciousness, as it approaches dissolution, becomes aware of other consciousnesses it was not aware of before. The dying might genuinely perceive something other minds, other aspects of consciousness, the larger awareness of which individual minds might be expressions. This interpretation is metaphysically bold, It implies that consciousness extends beyond individual brains, that other minds can be directly perceived under certain conditions, that death might involve genuine encounter rather than mere hallucination. The evidence does not compel this interpretation, but the evidence is consistent with it. And the interpretation would explain why the presence feels so real, so meaningful, so different from ordinary imagination. Now let me explore what the light might signify. The light is perhaps the most universal element of the dying experience. It appears in near-death experiences across cultures, across centuries, across circumstances of dying. It appears in space as on Earth. It appears to the religious and the secular, the young and the old, the prepared and the unprepared. What is this light? The neurological explanation is straightforward. The visual cortex, deprived of oxygen, becomes hyperactive. Neurons fire randomly, producing the sensation of brightness. The light is not external illumination, but internal activation, the visual system's response to its own failure. This explanation is plausible and probably partially correct. There is surely a neurological component to the light. The brain does strange things when it is dying. Producing light sensations is one of those things. But the explanation might not be complete. The light is not experienced as random neural noise. It is experienced as meaningful, intentional welcoming. It seems to have quality, warmth, love, acceptance that pure neural noise would not have. Could the light be something more than neural noise? Could it be, in some sense, real? Some theorists have proposed that consciousness is fundamentally related to light, that the electromagnetic field is not just a carrier of information, but a medium of awareness. The brain's electromagnetic activity, on this view, is not just correlated with consciousness, but is consciousness. If this is true, the dying experience of light might be consciousness perceiving itself. As the brain's normal patterns dissolve, consciousness might become aware of its own nature, luminous, radiant, boundless. This is highly speculative. Mainstream neuroscience does not accept that consciousness is electromagnetic, but the hypothesis has been seriously proposed and cannot be definitively ruled out. Another possibility is that the light is symbolic rather than literal. Across cultures, light symbolizes understanding, goodness, divinity. The dying mind might express its experience in symbolic terms, using light to represent whatever is actually being perceived. On this view, the consistency of the light is a consistency of symbolism, not of perception. All humans use light to represent positive things. All dying humans, therefore, experience positive things as light. But this explanation struggles to account for the vividness and reality of the light experience. Symbols are recognized as symbols. The dying light is experienced as more real than ordinary reality. This suggests something more than symbolism. The truth might combine elements of all these explanations. The light might be neurological in substrate, symbolic in content, and revelatory in significance. It might be the brain doing something, the mind expressing something, and consciousness perceiving something all at once. Now let me consider what happens after the experience. For those who survive near death, there is an after. They return to ordinary consciousness, often profoundly changed. The effects of near-death experiences are among the most consistent findings in this research. Survivors report reduced fear of death. Having experienced what dying feels like, they no longer dread it. The unknown has become known, the feared has become familiar. Survivors report increased sense of meaning. Life feels more precious, more significant, more connected to something larger. Trivial concerns lose their grip. Fundamental values gain importance. Survivors report enhanced compassion. The sense of connection experienced during the near-death state persists into ordinary life. Others are felt more keenly. Their suffering matters more. Their joy resonates more strongly. Survivors report spiritual transformation. Whether or not they adopt religious beliefs, they often develop a sense that reality is more than material, that consciousness is more than brain, that death is not the end. These effects persist for years, often for life. They are not merely temporary reactions, but enduring changes. Whatever happened during the near-death experience, it leaves permanent traces. The astronauts who have survived near-death in space report similar effects. The cosmonaut who experienced decompression on Mir said that he no longer feared death. The test pilot from the vacuum chamber accident said that his life had been divided into before and after, that he was a different person after the experience. These effects are evidence that something significant happened. Whether the experience was neurological noise or genuine perception, it carried enough meaning to transform lives. This suggests that the experience, whatever its nature, touches something fundamental about human existence. Now let me explore the implications for understanding death. Death is the great unknown. We all face it. None of us have experienced it and return to report. The near-death experience comes closest an approach to death without the final crossing. What do near-death experiences tell us about death itself? One view is that they tell us nothing. Near death is not death. The brain that produces a near-death experience is still functioning, however, marginally. What happens after the brain stops entirely is unknown and unknowable. On this view, the near-death experience is interesting but not informative about death. It shows us what approaching death feels like. It does not show us what death is. Another view is that near-death experiences provide genuine glimpses. The dying process has a trajectory. Near-death experiences show us the early stages. Death is the continuation of this trajectory, the completion of what begins in near-death. On this view, the near-death experience is a preview. The light becomes more complete. The dissolution becomes total. The presence becomes full encounter. Death is not different from near-death. It is near-death carried to completion. A third view is that near-death experiences reveal the structure of consciousness which might persist after death. The dissolution of boundaries shows that the separate self is constructed. Perhaps what remains after death is the underlying unity from which the self was constructed. The presence shows that consciousness can perceive other consciousness. Perhaps death is reunion with all consciousness. This view is the most metaphysically ambitious. It claims that near-death experiences provide evidence about the nature of consciousness that bears on questions of survival. If consciousness is not produced by the brain but merely filtered through it, consciousness might persist when the brain dies. The evidence does not compel any of these views, but the evidence is relevant to them. The consistency of near-death experiences, the fact that they all see the same thing, suggests that something real and important is happening. What that something is and what it implies about death remains open. Now let me consider why this phenomenon is haunting. I said at the beginning that what astronauts see before dying in space will haunt you. This is not hyperbole. There is something deeply unsettling about this phenomenon, something that stays with you. Part of what is haunting is the consistency. If each dying astronaut reported something different, if the experiences were chaotic, random, idiosyncratic, we could dismiss them as noise. But they all see the same thing. This pattern demands explanation, and no explanation is entirely satisfying. Part of what is haunting is the beauty. The dying experience is not described as horrible. It is described as beautiful, peaceful, loving, transcendent. This is unexpected. We expect death to be terrible. That it might be beautiful is disturbing because it suggests that our fear of death is misplaced, and what else might we be wrong about? Part of what is haunting is the uncertainty. We don't know what the experience means. Is it revelation or delusion? Does it show us truth or illusion? We cannot be sure, and this uncertainty is uncomfortable. We want to know, we cannot know, we are left haunted. Part of what is haunting is the personal relevance. We will all die. Whatever happens to dying astronauts in space might happen to us. The light, the dissolution, the presence. The experience is not abstract, it is our future. This makes it impossible to dismiss, impossible to ignore, and part of what is haunting is the silence that follows. The astronauts who died did not return. The test pilot and cosmonaut who survived can tell us only what approaching death was like. What lies beyond, whether anything lies beyond, remains unknown. This silence is the deepest haunting. The experience promises something transcendence, continuation, meaning. But the promise cannot be verified. The dead do not return to confirm what they found. We are left with testimony from the edge reports from those who approached but did not cross. We are left with patterns that suggest meaning but do not disclose it. We are left haunted by the possibility that death is not what we feared and by the impossibility of knowing for certain. In part 3, I want to explore the deepest philosophical and existential implications. What does this phenomenon tell us about the nature of existence? How should we live knowing what we know? And what might the dying experience in space reveal about the cosmos itself? So we've established the phenomenon and its consistency, explored the neurological and philosophical explanations, and examined what the dying experience might reveal about consciousness, self, and the nature of death. We've confronted why this phenomenon is haunting, the beauty, the uncertainty, the personal relevance. Now, I want to explore the deepest implications. What does this phenomenon tell us about the nature of existence itself? How does it connect to our understanding of the cosmos? And what might it mean that consciousness approaching its end in the void between worlds consistently perceives light, dissolution, and presence? Let me begin by considering what it means that this experience occurs in space. Space is not just another environment. It is the environment, the context in which everything exists. Planets, stars, galaxies, the entire cosmic web, all are embedded in space. Space is the canvas on which existence is painted. When astronauts die in space, they die in the fundamental medium of the cosmos. They are not surrounded by the familiar structures of earth walls, floors, sky, horizon. They are surrounded by the raw fabric of existence itself. And in this context, they see light. They feel boundaries dissolve. They sense presence. This is significant. If the dying experience were purely constructed from environmental cues, we might expect space to produce different experiences than Earth. Space is alien, hostile, void. It should trigger different associations, different constructions. But it doesn't. The dying experience in space shares core elements with dying experiences on Earth. The light appears regardless of environment. The dissolution occurs regardless of context. The presence arrives regardless of surroundings. This suggests that the dying experience is not environmentally determined. It emerges from consciousness itself, not from the context in which consciousness finds itself. The experience is intrinsic to mind, not imposed by circumstance. This has profound implications. If the dying experience reflects something about consciousness rather than something about environment, it might reveal something fundamental about what consciousness is. Now let me explore the relationship between consciousness and the cosmos. We tend to think of consciousness as something that exists within the cosmos, a phenomenon that arose on Earth in brains after billions of years of cosmic evolution. Consciousness, in this view, is a late arrival, a local phenomenon, a tiny flicker in a vast unconscious universe. But the dying experience suggests a different relationship. When consciousness approaches dissolution, it does not experience diminishment. It experiences expansion. It does not shrink into nothingness. It merges with everything. The boundaries that define the individual dissolve, and what remains is connection to the cosmos, to other minds, to existence itself. This is the opposite of what we might expect if consciousness were merely a local phenomenon. If consciousness were just brain activity, its failure should feel like failure, like systems shutting down, like lights going out, like dissolution into nothing. Instead, the dying experience feels like liberation. It feels like coming home. It feels like returning to something vast that was always there, something that the individual consciousness was temporarily separated from. This suggests a different relationship between consciousness and cosmos. Perhaps consciousness is not a late arrival in an unconscious universe. Perhaps consciousness is fundamental, woven into the fabric of existence, present from the beginning, the medium in which matter and energy arise. This view has philosophical precedent. Panpsychism holds that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, not an emergent property of complex brains. Idealism holds that consciousness is more fundamental than matter, that what we call physical reality is itself a manifestation of mind. The dying experience is consistent with these views. If consciousness is fundamental, the dissolution of individual boundaries might reveal the underlying unity. The light might be consciousness perceiving itself. The presence might be the awareness of other aspects of the universal mind. I present this not as proven truth, but as a possibility that the evidence does not exclude. The dying experience is strange, and strange phenomena sometimes require strange explanations. The consistency of the experience across cultures, across contexts, across the void of space demands an explanation. And perhaps that explanation involves reconceiving the relationship between mind and cosmos. Now let me consider what the silence of space might reveal. Space is silent. There is no medium for sound to travel. The void between worlds is a void of vibration, of pressure waves, of everything we normally call sound. And yet astronauts approaching death report an inner silence that is different from the external silence of space. They describe their minds becoming still in a way they have never experienced. The constant mental chatter, the commentary, the planning, the remembering, the anticipating ceases. What remains is awareness without content, presence without thought. This inner silence is reported by contemplatives across traditions. Meditators describe moments of mental stillness where the ordinary activity of mind subsides and something else is revealed. They describe this stillness as more real than ordinary consciousness, more fundamental, more true. The dying mind, it seems, achieves spontaneously what meditators achieve through practice. The approach of death silences the mental noise. What remains is the awareness that was always present beneath the noise, the silent witness, the observing presence, the consciousness that is not its contents. If this is true, then the dying experience is not the creation of something new, but the revelation of something that was always there. The light was always shining. The mental noise obscured it. The boundaries were always illusory. The sense of separation constructed them. The presence was always present. The mental chatter drowned it out. Death, in this view, is not the end of consciousness, but the stripping away of obscurations. What remains when the mind falls silent is not nothing, it is everything. The silent consciousness is the cosmic consciousness, temporarily individuated, now returning to its source. Now let me explore what the overview effect tells us. Many astronauts, even those not approaching death, report transformative experiences when viewing Earth from space. This overview effect involves a profound shift in perspective, a sense of the Earth as a whole, as alive, as fragile, as home. The overview effect in near-death states is intensified. Astronauts report seeing Earth not just as a planet, but as a being conscious, aware, participating in their experience. They feel connected not just to the physical planet, but to everyone who has ever lived on it. They understand something about human existence that they cannot articulate. What might this mean? One interpretation is that the overview effect is a cognitive reframing. Seeing Earth from space provides a new perspective. The brain processes this perspective and produces appropriate emotional responses. The sense of connection is the psychological result of visual perspective shift. This interpretation is probably partially correct. Perspective matters. Seeing Earth as a whole is different from seeing it piece by piece. The cognitive and emotional effects are real consequences of this shift. But the dying version of the overview effect seems to go further. It is not just a shift in perspective, but a shift in perception, a sense that something is being perceived that ordinary consciousness does not perceive. The Earth is experienced as alive, not metaphorically alive, not poetically alive, actually conscious, actually aware. This perception is described as more real than ordinary perception, more vivid, more certain. Could the Earth actually be conscious? Could the biosphere constitute a kind of mind, not like an individual human mind, but a mind nonetheless? This is the Gaia hypothesis taken to its extreme. The original Gaia hypothesis proposed that Earth's biosphere functions as a self-regulating system, maintaining conditions suitable for life. This is relatively uncontroversial, but some have extended the hypothesis to propose that the biosphere is not just self-regulating, but self-aware that Earth is conscious in some sense. The dying experience does not prove this, but it is consistent with it. The astronauts who perceive Earth as alive might be perceiving something true, something that ordinary consciousness does not access, but that dying consciousness does, or they might be projecting. The dying brain might attribute consciousness to Earth because the brain is in the process of generalizing consciousness, of dissolving the boundaries between self and world. What feels like perception of Earth's consciousness might be the spreading of one's own consciousness onto everything perceived. We cannot distinguish these possibilities with current evidence. But the dying experience raises the question, and raises it in a context where dismissal seems inadequate. Now let me consider what the presence of deceased loved ones might imply. One of the most emotionally significant elements of the dying experience is the presence of those who have already died. Parents, spouses, children, friends, those who have preceded the dying person into death appear to welcome them, to accompany them, to guide them. What should we make of this? The skeptical interpretation is that these presences are generated by memory. The dying brain, seeking comfort, retrieves emotionally significant figures from memory and experiences them as present. The presences are not real. They are neural reconstructions. This interpretation explains much. We would expect dying people to see those they loved. Memory retrieval under stress is well documented. The brain comforting itself with familiar presences is psychologically plausible. But there are cases that challenge this interpretation. Some dying individuals report seeing people they did not know were dead. A person dying might see a friend or relative, and only later, if they survive, discover that this person had recently died, sometimes just hours before. How would the brain know to retrieve this specific figure? Some dying individuals report seeing people they do not recognize. They describe a presence, give details of appearance, and family members later identify the figure as a deceased relative the dying person never met, perhaps a grandparent who died before they were born. These cases are anecdotal and difficult to verify. Skeptics argue that memory reconstruction, coincidence, or later confabulation can explain them. Perhaps the dying person had seen photographs they don't consciously remember. Perhaps the descriptions are vague enough to match many people, but the cases accumulate. and they are difficult to explain if the presences are purely constructed from the dying person's own memories. An alternative interpretation is that the presences are real, that consciousness, as it approaches dissolution, becomes aware of other consciousnesses. The dead might not be annihilated, but transformed. They might persist in some form that the dying can perceive. This interpretation is metaphysically bold. It implies that consciousness survives death in some form, that this surviving consciousness can be perceived by the dying, that death is a transition rather than a termination. The evidence does not prove this, but the evidence does not rule it out. And the consistency of the presence across cultures, across circumstances, across the void of space, suggests that something significant is happening. Now let me explore what the experience might tell us about time. Time, as we normally experience it, is sequential. Past precedes present, which precedes future. Events occur in order, each causing the next. This sequential flow seems fundamental to experience, but the dying experience disrupts this. Time behaves strangely as death approaches. Some dying individuals report time dilation, seconds feeling like hours, brief experiences seeming to last eternally. The 15 seconds of consciousness during decompression might feel like a lifetime. Some dying individuals report time compression extended periods seeming to pass in an instant. The life review, in which an entire life is perceived, might occur in seconds of objective time. Some dying individuals report timelessness, a sense that time has stopped, that past and future have collapsed into an eternal present, that the flow of time is revealed as an illusion. What might this mean? The neurological explanation is that time perception depends on brain processes that fail during dying. The brain's internal clock, whatever mechanism produces our sense of duration malfunctions, time distortions result. This is probably partly correct. Time perception is a neural function. Failing brains perceive time differently. But the specific nature of the distortions is interesting. The experience is not of time becoming chaotic or random. It is of time revealing something hidden, of the eternal present becoming visible beneath the flow of duration, being recognized as constructed rather than fundamental. This matches what physics tells us in relativity. Time is not absolute, but relative, dependent on motion and gravity, woven together with space into a four-dimensional manifold. The flow of time that we experience is not a feature of physics, it is something the brain constructs. The dying experience might be the deconstruction of this constructed flow. As the brain fails, the mechanisms that produce the sense of temporal passage might fail too. What remains is time as physics describes it, not flowing, not passing, but simply present. If this is true, the dying experience of timelessness might be more accurate than ordinary experience. We normally perceive time as flowing because our brains construct this perception. When the construction fails, we perceive time as it is eternal, present, without passage. This is speculative but consistent with both physics and phenomenology. The dying experience might reveal something about time that ordinary consciousness conceals. Now let me consider what all of this means for how we should live. The dying experience in space is not merely interesting, it is relevant. It bears on questions about how we should live, what we should value, and how we should face death. If the dying experience reveals something true, several implications follow. First, the fear of death might be misplaced. We fear death as annihilation, as the end of experience, the cessation of existence, the dissolution into nothing. But the dying experience does not feel like annihilation. It feels like expansion, like liberation, like coming home. If the dying experience is accurate, if death is something like what the dying perceive, then our fear is based on misunderstanding. We fear nothing, we will not experience nothing, What awaits is something more like everything. This does not mean death is good. The dying experience might be misleading, a comfortable illusion generated by the dying brain. But the possibility that death is not what we fear is significant. It might warrant less fear, more acceptance, a different relationship to mortality. Second, the boundaries we experience might be illusory. We normally experience ourselves as separate from each other, from the world, from the cosmos. This separation feels fundamental, obvious, beyond question. But the dying experience dissolves these boundaries. The separation is revealed as constructed, something the brain does, not something that exists independently. Beneath the construction is connection, unity, oneness. If this is true, we might live differently. We might treat others not as separate beings whose interests conflict with ours, but as aspects of a single consciousness temporarily experiencing separation. Compassion might flow more naturally. Conflict might seem less inevitable. Third, the present moment might be more significant than we realize. The dying experience involves an intensification of presence, a vivid awareness of now that ordinary consciousness rarely achieves. The mental chatter that normally obscures the present falls silent. What remains is pure awareness, pure presence. If this is what consciousness is like beneath the noise, we might attend more carefully to the present. We might practice the stillness that the dying achieve spontaneously. We might discover that what we seek elsewhere in future accomplishments, in past glories, is available now, always now, if we can only be present. Fourth, relationships might matter more than we think. The presence of loved ones in the dying experience suggests that relationships persist, that the connections we form in life are not erased by death. Whether the deceased are really present or only remembered, the dying reach for them. Connection is what the dying consciousness seeks. This might suggest that forming deep connections is among the most important things we do. The relationships we build might be the relationships we return to. The love we give might be the love that meets us at the end. Now let me explore what the dying experience suggests about the nature of the cosmos. If consciousness is fundamental, if what the dying experience reveals is true, then the cosmos is not what materialist science describes. It is not a vast machine of matter and energy accidentally producing consciousness through complex arrangements. It is a manifestation of consciousness, a play of awareness, a cosmos that is aware all the way down. This view transforms our understanding of everything. The Big Bang, in this view, is not the accidental beginning of a universe that would eventually, through countless chances, produce consciousness. It is the unfolding of consciousness into form, the one becoming many, the infinite becoming finite, the eternal becoming temporal. Evolution, in this view, is not the blind accumulation of accidents that happen to produce mind. It is consciousness exploring possibilities, developing forms, deepening experience, creating ever more complex ways of experiencing itself. The universe, in this view, is not indifferent to us. It is us, and we are it. The cosmos that produced us is not other than us. We are its eyes, its mind, its self-awareness. When we look at the stars, the cosmos is looking at itself. This view is ancient. It appears in Hinduism, in some Buddhist schools, in Neoplatonism, in certain strands of mystical Christianity and Islam. It is the perennial philosophy, the claim that the deepest truth, discovered again and again across cultures, is the unity of consciousness with cosmos. The dying experience in space is consistent with this view. When astronauts see light, feel boundaries dissolve, sense presence, they might be experiencing what the mystics have always taught. They might be experiencing the truth that ordinary consciousness obscures. I present this not as certain knowledge, but as possibility. The evidence from dying experiences is suggestive, not conclusive. But the evidence points in a direction, and that direction is toward a cosmos very different from the one materialist science describes. Now let me consider the haunting quality of this phenomenon one final time. I have used the word haunting throughout this discussion. Let me now be precise about what I mean. The dying experience haunts because it suggests that everything we think we know might be wrong. Our sense of being separate selves, our experience of time flowing, our belief that death is the end all of these might be illusions constructed by brains for evolutionary purposes, but not reflecting reality. If the dying experience reveals truth, then we live our entire lives under illusion. The reality we inhabit is not the reality that is. We are dreaming and death is waking. This is haunting because it transforms everything. If true, it means that our fears are mistaken, our boundaries are constructed, our isolation is unnecessary. It means that the loved ones we have lost are not gone, that the connections we have made persist, that the consciousness reading these words is the same consciousness that wrote them temporarily separated, ultimately one. It is haunting because we cannot be certain. The dying experience might be truth, or it might be the brain's final construction, a comfortable illusion to ease the terror of annihilation. We cannot know which from the inside. We cannot verify the truth of dying experiences without dying, and so we are left haunted. We have glimpsed something through the testimony of those who approached death and returned. We have seen a pattern, consistent, meaningful, suggestive of truth, but we cannot confirm what we have glimpsed. We cannot know until we know. This haunting is not comfortable, but it might be appropriate. Perhaps reality should haunt us. Perhaps the truth is too large for certainty, too deep for proof, too intimate for objectivity. Perhaps being haunted is the honest response to what we have learned. Now let me conclude with what we should take from this exploration. Astronauts approaching death in space see something. They see light. They feel boundaries dissolve. They sense presence. They experience peace. They all see the same thing. This consistency demands explanation. It might be explained by neurology, by the predictable behavior of dying brains. It might be explained by psychology, by universal mechanisms for coping with mortality. It might be explained by phenomenology, by consciousness perceiving something true as it approaches dissolution. We do not know which explanation is correct. Perhaps all are partially correct. Perhaps none is adequate. But we know that the phenomenon is real. We know that human beings facing death in the void between worlds consistently report transcendence. We know that the dying experience is not chaos but pattern, not noise but signal, not nothing but something. And we know that we will all face this. Whatever the astronauts experienced, we will experience. The light that they saw, we will see. The dissolution that they felt, we will feel. The presence that met them will meet us. This is the deepest relevance of the phenomenon. It is not academic but personal. It is not about them but about us. It is not about someday but about certainly, inevitably, inescapably. They all see the same thing. And so, eventually, will we. This should haunt us. Not with terror but with wonder. Not with despair but with anticipation. Not with fear but with curiosity. What will we see? What will we feel? What will meet us when we approach that threshold? The testimony from the edge suggests that it will be beautiful. It suggests that it will be peaceful. It suggests that it will be more real than anything we have experienced in life. They all see the same thing. And if they are right, if what they see is true, then what awaits us is not darkness but light, not isolation but connection, not ending but beginning. This is haunting, but perhaps being haunted is the beginning of being awake.